through this together. Okay. So, uh, as I mentioned before, or actually I haven't mentioned this yet, this book, it's only 2 chapters, and really it's just 4 different prophecies. And as you can see here, they all fall on different days, which I mentioned before, tend to be seen as festival days. Now, the third and the fourth prophecies are actually on the same day, but in different times of the day. But regardless, these are the times and kind of when they match up to our calendar. So for us, the first prophecy would have been sometime late August. And then it goes on until like the middle of December. So as I said before, this is only about a 4 month period of ministry that we see from Haggai, and then we never hear from him again. But going into verse 1, I'm going to just, when I normally do this, I have people have the translations in front of them. I usually print out 2 different translations so they can look through this. But because I can't really do that right now, I'll just read the verse to you and then we'll go through with it. So verse 1, in the 2nd year of King Darius, on the 1st day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest. Now, if you want to understand what a new moon is, because it talks about the first day of the month. The first day of the month in the Jewish calendar was a lunar calendar. So the first day of the month is always the new moon. So that's when the moon is basically starting. So it's basically where you don't see a moon at all. And then depending on what side like of the globe you're in, whether you're on the northern hemisphere or southern hemisphere, you'll start to see it coming either from the right or to the left. But the new moon is considered the beginning of the month. And so the reason why this is important, and this is actually something that's mentioned in the Bible, but no one really talks about, is that the new moon festival happened every single month. And so the first day of the month, when the new moon came out, the Israelites would gather and they would give these many offerings, a very large burnt offering, grain offering, drink offering, and a sin offering. And basically, this was a big festival. And so there would be, what these offerings often is basically big barbecues. So there's meat being grilled, basically given unto the Lord, but also shared among some of the people. And the concept behind this was that every single month, the Jews were dedicating that month to the Lord. They were thanking the Lord for providing for them, but they're all saying, this new month we are giving unto you. And honestly, I kind of wish we kind of had something similar in the modern church, just because I think it's important to have those type of frequent reminders. And so this is something that they did, and it was also a day of rest. So this is something aside from the Sabbath. So whether this fell on the Sabbath or not, this too was a day of rest. So it was a time that you could enjoy what God had given you, time that you could spend with family. And so this was a very significant day that happened every single month to the Jewish people. And that is the day that this first prophecy arrived. Through the prophet Haggai, literally the Hebrew is saying by the hand of Haggai the prophet. This is a very common expression used among many of the different prophets. And so basically what you have to understand is the job of a prophet was to deliver the message of God. So God gave him this word, and it was his job to deliver it to the people. And so it tells you that verse 2, it tells who the first message is for. But then verse 4 to 11 is a much more general word that actually goes to all of the people. And so we'll get into that a little bit later. But here we see that Haggai is meant to deliver this message first to Zerubbabel and Joshua, and then to all the people of Israel. Now, Zerubbabel, I keep saying Zerubbabel, but I realize that it's actually Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is the son of Shealtiel, who was the son of Jehoiakim, the last king. Now, there are disputes, because if you look at First Chronicles, it says that Zerubbabel was the son of Pedaiah, but the rest of the Bible actually says he's the son of Shealtiel. Regardless whether it's Shealtiel or Pedaiah, he's from the line of David. And so it's significant because he comes as a ruler, he comes as the governor, as it said in this passage, but he represents the line of David, which follows in the line or the promise that David had received from God, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago. Now, Joshua is from the line of Jozadak, and Jozadak was the son of Sariah, the last high priest over the temple. And so Joshua is, he's the current high priest, even though there isn't a temple. Technically speaking, you can't have a high priest without a temple. But even so, the temple hasn't been rebuilt yet, but they still call him Joshua the high priest. Now, unfortunately, Joshua the high priest maybe wasn't a good father, because his sons, as we see in the book of Ezra, chapter 10, verse 18, his sons were also guilty of intermarriage. They married non-Jews, and this was likely for some type of personal benefit to them. But this was something that was constantly spoken against, not necessarily because God is racist, but more that God was wanting his people to stay religiously pure. Regardless, these two are the ones that are receiving the word of God that comes in verse 2. That this is what the Lord says. This is what the Lord Almighty says. These people say, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. So first, Lord Almighty. Some of your translations will say Lord of hosts. Some of them will say Lord of armies. I think this is Yahweh Shevaot. But this is basically a title used for God mostly from the latter prophets. And so it's used in this book quite a lot, 14 times, but it's used mostly in the prophetic books like, say, Isaiah, and so on and so forth. But it starts actually with Hannah. So in 1 Samuel chapter 1, Hannah, she couldn't have a child, and so she pleaded with the Lord, and she's the first person in the Bible who called him Lord Almighty, the Lord of hosts. Now, literally what that means, Lord of hosts, Lord of armies, Shevaot, is basically literally armies. So it's saying God is in control of all the armies. God is you can say like God is all powerful, and that's why it's often translated as Lord Almighty. But what's important to know about this particular title of God is it was always proclaimed by people that had no one else, right? Hannah had no one else she could turn to solve her problem. The people in the latter prophets, they were exiled, they were taken away from Jerusalem. Everything had been taken away from them. And so in a similar way, they were always calling him Lord Almighty. And this contrast with Darius, who at the time was the most powerful king in all the world, right? Persia was the greatest empire at that time. So people would say he has the greatest army. But by proclaiming Lord Almighty, they were proclaiming that God is God of all. God is more powerful than Darius. Okay, you will see this title again and again through the book of Haggai. It says, "These people say." Now, what you're seeing is a very clear distinction being made that God is telling Zerubbabel and Joshua, this is what your people are saying. And he's making this distinction. They've said this from before, and they are continuing to say this now. And what are they saying? The time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. So this is the question. You have to remember our context is they first came, Joshua and Zerubbabel, they led this exile, this return to Jerusalem from Babylon 20 years ago. 20 years has passed, okay? And they started by building the foundation to the temple, but then they quit. And so 20 years has passed, and from that time, they have continually said this, the time has not yet come to rebuild the Lord's house. So why would they make this conclusion? Number one, as we know, there were people from the outside. There were the Samaritans and other nations around them that were giving them pressure, and they were making it hard for them to move on. So they were scared. Now, for whatever reason, King Cyrus, who had allowed them to go freely, did not intervene in this opposition. So they didn't know what to do. The other issue is, as you see in the text, there was a drought. So they didn't have the food that they needed. So even their day-to-day struggle of surviving was hard, because it was hard for them to get money to buy the food that they needed. Because they couldn't produce it themselves, they had to get it from the outside. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like this, but when I lived in Russia, all the supermarkets only sell exported goods. Like Russia doesn't really produce much of its own stuff because it's too expensive. So everything's coming from other nations. And so that's kind of the situation Jerusalem was in. They couldn't produce their own crops, so they had to get it from the outside, which meant it was more expensive. And so they didn't know how to survive on a day-to-day. Now, the other thing is some of them might have calculated. They're like, Jeremiah said that there was going to be 70 years of exile, but we actually got out a little bit early. So, the temple was destroyed back then, but it hasn't been 70 years yet. It's only been like 50 years. So the time hasn't come yet. So there's some people think maybe they were calculating, oh, we got to wait until 70 years pass. And so they're just, we'll wait until that happens. Another thought is Ezekiel had given the prophecy that the temple would be rebuilt when the Messiah came. And so some of them might have been waiting for this Messiah to come and just giving this kind of, this kind of just logical thought, oh, we can't do anything until this person shows up. Regardless, there are many, many reasons why they were doing this. But what's very clear from this text, God was not happy with this decision. God was not happy with whatever reason they were using. So continuing verse 3 and 4, then the word Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Is it a time for you yourselves to be living in your paneled houses while this house remains a ruin? So this you and your, it continually shows up in this next segment from verse 4 to 11. So God is now talking to the people that he said this people or these people earlier. Now he's talking to them and saying, you, your, all this stuff that you're doing, this is how it's happening. And he's saying instead of what you had gone there for, the reason why they had gone to Jerusalem was specifically to rebuild the temple of God. But instead, they were living in their own houses. Now, paneled houses, that word in Hebrew is a little bit archaic, a little bit hard to understand, but it makes it sound like it's not a very it's basically like you're upgrading your house, right? So you can have a house, but they're like putting panels, they're making it a little bit nicer. And so basically God is saying, you not only do you have a place to live in, but you're upgrading your place rather than actually doing what you came for, which was to build my house, right? So they had made this decision that it wasn't time to rebuild, but instead it was time for them to dwell in their own houses, to live their own lives. And so what you have this contrast is the temple of God that they had meant to rebuild lied in ruin, right? I'll get back to this word a little bit later, but it was ruin. All it was a foundation, whereas they themselves were living in paneled houses. Verse 5, now this is what the Lord Almighty says. Give careful thought to your ways. Now, who likes this version a little bit better? I like to consider your ways a little bit better. But right where it says now, okay? In the Hebrew, it's and now. And so this gives a very clear distinction from what was said earlier up until verse 4, is that this is what God is saying. Now pay attention. Back here, the question is it time for this? And verse 5 is assuming the answer. Of course it's not. So now listen to what the Lord has to say to you. Give careful thought to your ways. Now this is a very important phrase. It is repeated again in chapter 1, verse 7, but it's also repeated in chapter 2, verses 15 and 18. Many would say this very small phrase is probably one of the key themes of the entire book of Haggai. Now, your ways really is a reflection upon what they're doing, right? What they're achieving, the things that they have done up until this point, and in many ways, what they will continue to do. And so what God is saying in this very short phrase, consider your ways, give careful thought to your ways, is to really contrast what you're doing versus what God's desire and intention is, right? And to me, this was what stuck out to me, the consider your ways, back when I read this as an engineer, and the way I was living my life and what I was doing on a day-to-day basis. I was really just confronted with, am I living in a way that honors God and seeks out what God's true intention and desire is? I'm going to stop preaching, but basically that's really this hook, this phrase is what is supposed to really capture the hearts of the Jews to understand what they've actually been doing for the past 20 years. Verse 6, You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a house or put them in a purse with holes in it. So basically, you're giving this contrast. They had sowed, they had put seeds into the ground, but very little came out of it. They actually were eating, but they weren't actually being satisfied by what they ate. They were able to drink, but not to the point of drunkenness, right? That they weren't able to get the full benefit of what they were drinking. Not to say that drunkenness is a good thing. Don't get drunk, people. Um, but don't. And it says they were clothing themselves, but they felt no warmth. And then, the earned wages, basically what was literally being translated here is hiring themselves out as servants. They were hiring themselves out as servants, but literally it felt like their purse, what they were putting their money to, had holes in it. Now, some of you might understand what that feeling is. You're working on a day-to-day base, but it feels like you got nothing left. I think a lot of us have an understanding of what that feeling is. So ultimately, brothers and sisters, what they were experiencing is everything was a struggle. There was nothing left. There was no satisfaction. And so ultimately what was being shown is they were living outside of the blessing of God. They had come there with a purpose. For whatever reason, they stopped following that purpose. And they were now struggling and living outside of God's blessing. Verse 7, this is what the Lord Almighty says, give careful thought to your ways. Now you might look at this and this looks almost exactly the same as the previous verse. But what this is actually telling us is verse 5 was saying, consider your ways, give careful thought to your ways because what you're doing is wrong. But now verse 7, by repeating it, it's basically saying, give careful thought to your ways because if you choose to live in the right way, you can be blessed. Okay? It's the reason why it's being repeated. Verse 5 was there to help them to recognize that what they were doing was wrong. But verse 7 is there to show them that this could be changed, that they could actually live a life where they felt fulfilled and they could dwell in the blessing of God. So verse 8 turns it around. It says, go up into the mountains and bring down timber and build my house so that I may take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. So many people see this one verse as basically the main theme, the main verse for all of Haggai. And there's 3 commands. Go up, right? Bring down and build. So they're going to go up into the mountains, bring down the timber, bring down the wood, and build the house. And then it says, if you do this, God will be pleased and God will be honored. Now, what's translated is God will be honored is actually literally will reveal my glory, right? So if you do this, if you go up into the mountains, if you bring down the timber and you build the house of the Lord, he will be pleased and he will reveal his glory. Now that's an important phrase because the glory of God, if you remember the time of the Exodus, when they're wandering in the desert, the Shekinah glory, this cloud of pillar and fire that guided them, in day and night. God is saying that glory will return. Now, this glory also happened when the temple was built by Solomon. When they opened the temple up, they were worshiping. This cloud showed up, and it became so thick that they had to stop worshiping. God was saying, my glory, my presence will return if you build my temple once more. So God is making this promise that God will be present with you. Verse 9, you expected much, but see, it turned out to be little. What you brought home, I blew away. Why, declares the Lord Almighty? Because of my house, which remains a ruin, while each of you is busy with your own house. So again, you have these contrasts. They had these high expectations. They weren't met. And God says, he literally did this. Whatever you brought, I blew it away. Who is this who's saying this? The Lord Almighty, the Lord of hosts, the all-powerful God. Why is this happening? Because my house, which you came to rebuild, remains a ruin. And instead of taking care of my house, you are running each to your own house, right? You're busy with your own house. You are living your own life. Verse 10, Therefore, because of you, the heavens have withheld their dew and the earth its crops. So again, therefore, because of what they have done, because of them running to their own houses, because of them living their own lives, even though rains are being withheld, right? Even the crops are not coming up because of what has happened. Because I called for a drought on the fields and the mountains, on the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, and everything else the ground produces, on people and livestock, and all the labor of your hands. So God, again, he's making it clear. He's the one who did this. The stuff you brought home, he blew it away. He also called for a drought. Now, this word drought, horeb, is very, very similar to the word ruin, which was used in verse 4 and 9 when it was talking about the temple of God. So the temple of God laid in ruin, hareb. Because of this, the people were experiencing drought, horeb. So God is using this play on words to show what he's doing to them. And this drought affected everything, the fields, the mountains, the grain, the new wine, the olive oil, everything the ground produces, people, livestock, all the labor of their hands. Because of their disobedience, all aspects of their lives are being affected in a negative way. Verse 12, then Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the whole remnant of the people obeyed the voice of the Lord their God and the message of the prophet Haggai, because the Lord their God had sent him, and the people feared the Lord. So they obey. They recognize that what Haggai is saying is the word of God. And it says the reason why they listened to him is because God had sent him. So it's very clear that this is God. This is not Haggai. This is not Haggai just using his own earthly wisdom. It's very clear that Haggai is being used as a messenger of God. And then it says the people feared the Lord. Now, oftentimes when we use the word fear, we kind of make it a little bit less scary and say they're just being reverent, they're being respectful. But the fear here literally was terror. They realized that for 20 years, they had been disobeying God. And because of this, God was revealing it to them through this drought, revealing it to them through this difficult season. And that made them afraid, and as it should. Like, honestly, if you recognize that for 20 years you have been disobeying God, it's natural to have that fear of knowing that you have done wrong for so long. And it's become so clear to you. Verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people. I am with you, declares the Lord. So Haggai is called the Lord's messenger, which is malach, right? That's where the word, or that's where Malachi gets his name from, my messenger, Malachi. And so Haggai, the Lord's messenger. And the message he gives is, I am with you. This is very important. Number one, I am with you, as you guys all know. That's basically what Emmanuel means, God with you. But the other thing is, this is in response to the fear of the people. They are deathly afraid of what God has done, or what God, because of the anger of God. And so they have chosen to obey. But oftentimes, whenever you see fear in the Bible, when the people are afraid, God says, do not fear. Why? Because I am with you. God is offering comfort, right? God is offering them to know that his presence is still with them, even though they've been disobedient for 20 years. I am with you. Verse 14, so the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God. So finally, the people, they've already made the decision, but now you're seeing a stirring of spirit. So you have to understand, they made the decision based upon fear. But because God has promised them that his presence is with them, that he is with them, that is actually what stirred their spirits. That is actually what motivated them to press on and to actually finish the job. So this stirring is something that happened before, right? In Ezra 1:5, 20 years ago when they first came to Jerusalem, that was when that stirring first happened. But for whatever reason, for 20 years, they stopped doing it. But now that spirit has been restirred in their hearts. And so now they're going to complete the house of the Lord Almighty. Verse 15, on the 24th day of the 6th month. Now, if you do your math, 23 days later is when they actually finally start doing the work. So some of you might be like, wait a minute, like how come they didn't act on this right away? On the first day of the month, they got this word, they were convicted, but 23 days later is actually when they actually started to work on this. What you have to understand is the 6th month was a harvest month. So they had a lot of work to do. They had, a lot of crops and stuff that they had to take care of. And even, aside from that too, even rebuilding the temple, they didn't have the material to do it. So they had to go get the timber. They had to go get all these different things. So that's why 23 days had to pass, because they needed to make sure they had the material as well as the manpower to do what they needed to do. And so ultimately, finally, they acted upon in obedience with what God had asked them to do. So ultimately, God is the one who spoke to them. After 20 years of disobedience, after 20 years of basically just doing whatever they wanted and living their own lives, God spoke. And then God revealed the reality of what was going on. That the reason why they are living such hard lives, the reason why they always felt unsatisfied, was because of this disobedience. But God promised that if they do this, that his glory would return. If they do this, he will be pleased. And he also promises them that he is with them, that he will be with them throughout this entire process. So God spoke, God revealed, and God promised. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and split you guys off for the discussion in terms of what we've looked at. And yeah, I'll send you guys the no desktop closing discussion.